Yeah, welcome, Roy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, and I hand over to you.
Thank you for coming. I'm beginning this talk with a work that is really old. It's 25 years ago that I did it. And were this conversation to have taken place 3 or 4 years ago, probably I would not have shown it. I would be too embarrassed. But fortunately, it just was published 25 years later. And in retrospect, I think it has a lot of motifs that appear in my work later on. What this is a page from an artist's book called The Blind Merchant, which is a kind of a retelling of The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. Perhaps a book we remember most of all because it offers the quintessential figure of the Jew, that is Shylock. Interestingly enough, a Jew in a time where in England there were hardly any Jews, but it started a tradition of the way that the Jew has been figuring into English literature ever since, up to the late 19th century with Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, where the role is sort of reversed, okay? And what I did was to try and take this play and adopt the viewpoint of Shylock himself. I was living in New York at the time, so I felt, and I'm not a native speaker of English, so writing in English, not knowing the language full well, was sort of like trying to draw with my eyes closed. But on a personal basis, it was also a kind of a doubling, having a book that has 2 voices, 2 texts, 3 voices because it's 2 texts and images, but also the drawings themselves are doubled, you know, they have 2 different identities, and also a form of self-negation, yeah, of trying to give myself a task of trying to see to the best of my ability, but without being able to see. And you'll see that later on, both this theme of doubling of voices and kind of negating myself became common motifs in my work. And these are drawings that take place in Belmont. The story is that Portia is a rich woman who inherited a lot of money from her father, and all the suitors that come to win her heart have to go through a test of choosing one of 3 caskets, and they all fail. And it's literally a kind of castration, because they have to vow before they approach her never to approach a woman again if they fail. So it's really a castration, and all of them fail. And this is a scene where Portia, which I cast the woman who was then my wife, is speaking with her servant, Lady Nerissa, here played by Louise Brooks, about all the suitors who lost. So you see all those carrots, all those the phalluses that accumulate. This is already in the 4th act. It's the scene of the trial. If you remember, Shylock lends money to Antonio, but he asks for a pound of flesh as an interest. And the pound of flesh, of course, is the heart. He wants to kill Antonio because he's an evil Jew. So this is the scene. And then Portia, disguised as a male judge, is the one who wins the game by telling Shylock that he can take the flesh but not blood, not even 1 drop of blood, and he loses everything. So it's also a play with a lot of themes of gender bender, right? Men being emasculated and women appearing in the strong positions. And here you can see a very similar scene. These are 2 consecutive pages. You see the version with eyes open and the version with eyes closed. And the entire last act, the 5th act, is really the happy end, the romantic happy end. Shylock is no longer on stage. He was coerced to convert to Christianity. He lost all his fortune. His daughter betrayed him even. But the book chooses to stay with Shylock, providing a series of variations on a very, very famous work of art, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters by Goya from the Los Caprichos. Here, assuming this almost animistic quality, here I have only 2, but there are 15 images, ending with the opening of the eyes. So that's The Blind Merchant. So the next work that I'm going to show a snippet of is a series of paintings called martyr paintings. And in many ways, it was a continuation of the work I did on Shakespeare, because again, hagiographies and Krishna iconography are bodies of knowledge that are by definition Christian, Catholic, but in a way they also belong to me, right, as a painter. As a painter, being educated in the Western world, you have nothing but the tradition of Krishna iconography, Judaism being quite an iconoclastic religion. But it was also a question of trying to stipulate my identity not by some kind of sovereign or self-defined process, which is very much, let's say, the heritage I come from, because I come from Israel, where the entire national project is that of imagining a new Jew, right? And thinking of that Jew, of course, as virile and military and strong, but as sovereign, not only in the political sense, but also in the sense that you define your own identity. So dialectically, I think that by trying to define myself from within the canon of Christianity, I was trying to create a position that was exactly the opposite of the Zionist one that tries to claim that identity is quite real, but it's fictional in the same time, and the parameters of fictions, the way that it is being constructed, has already preceded me. Yeah? I can come into it, I can try to assert myself in it, but a lot of things there are given. Okay? So my approach in this series of paintings, all in all there were about 40 of them, was to take the stories of the saints. Some of them are quite known and some of them are easily recognized by their attributes. For instance, this is, many of you I'm sure would know Saint Lucy, who's often represented carrying her eyes on a plate. But I cast, again, like in a play, I cast myself and close friends as the Christian martyrs. Martyrology for me was also interesting because it's a kind of a twilight zone, both between fact and fiction, because some of the saints were real characters, while others were really mythologized or completely fictional. It is also a moment, I think, in early Christianity where if we tend to think of religion as a kind of oppressive and repressive system, early Christianity was in effect had a lot of emancipatory aspects, especially for women, of course, because if a woman in the 2nd century, for instance, had to begin bearing children when she was 15, because mortality rate of infants was about 80%, then by vowing her virginity to Christ, her celestial groom, it meant that her life would be dedicated to learning, right? A much more masculine at the time role. So the paintings also reflect this kind of gender bender. So myself as a woman martyr, and also I guess an ambivalence in terms of the position. Yeah? The position, I hope, cannot be reduced either to that of a worshipper, because it is not, but also it's not really ironic. Yeah? In the vignettes, you can see stories from the story of, chapters from the story of Lucy, like many other women martyrs. She was courted, she was very beautiful, she was courted by a pagan suitor on the left upper corner and rejected him. Then he gave her over to the pagan authorities, whom to abuse her as punishment threw her to a brothel, which in fact was a punishment that was meted to a lot of real Christian women at the time. But miraculously, according to several versions, all the clients of the brothel became blind. According to other versions, the miracle was that her body turned into stone. Then they tried to kill her by burning her, but miraculously she was saved from the fire. Her body did not catch fire. And that is another paradoxic motif in many hagiographies, because the martyr has to die, otherwise they're not martyrs, right? But to prove that they're really divine, their body often resists death until finally it gives up, okay? So there is this kind of, I think, common denominator in a way between hagiography and pornography. In both cases, you have a subject, and things that are very extreme are going on with the body, and then there is a kind of a transformation or reversal. The subject is denied or negated, he dies. In pornography, he is completely eradicated. in order for something else to be perpetuated, either desire, sexual desire in pornography, or religious faith in hagiography. Eventually, she died by a thrust of the sword to her throat. So that's St. Lucy. I'm only showing, I think, one more martyr, which is Perpetua. This was an extremely interesting case because she's a real woman, a very intelligent, noble Roman woman from the 2nd century who actually wrote her own, the beginning of her own hagiography. Someone else, of course, had to finish the story. But parts of it are very interesting. In fact, one of the earliest books we have that has been written by a woman. In one of the scenes, she has a vision of defeating Satan dressed as an evil-looking Egyptian. So that's the upper part. She then climbed to heaven and she stepped on the face of Satan on the first step of the ladder, which is the lower part over there. She goes through the bed to heaven. And then she was killed by the attack of a wild cow at the arena. Oh, and I'm showing one more martyr. This is a fake martyr. I mean, he's fake for many reasons. One being that you cannot become a martyr by committing suicide, right? This is not a legal way to become a martyr, to kill yourself. But also the killing is not very compelling because it's a little bit like the Baron of Munchausen, right? He's raising himself, denying gravity, and thus dying. But he's also fake because the connection between Eros and Thanatos, libidinal desire, and death is not covered up by any attributes or any stories, just plain and visible. Finally, of course, he's fake because he's not a human being. And in that sense, I think, in a way, it's a kind of a self-portrait because the monkey has been a symbol of painting throughout art history, right? Because the monkey mimics man like painting mimics nature, right? So many painters like Poussin and others painted monkeys painting, right? I rarely use prints. Usually it's hand-painted. Here, the basic technique is oil on paper. And you will see also later that you're right, that there is this kind of erasure. A figure is being rendered and then erased partially or fully. The way it's done is very simply by using gesso, which is a material that most painters use as a primer, and putting it on top of the oils. And that creates, if the brush is very dry, it creates a kind of screen, you know, like a noise, like a television white noise or something like that. And then occasionally there will be use of pastel or pencil. So very simple means. The work, for the most part, are small works, almost always on paper. I was thinking of myself at the time as using minor modes, you know, because this was the late 80s, early 90s. I was living in New York, and basically most of the art around me was either this kind of grandiose painting, like Eric Fischl, David Salle, Julian Schnabel, you know, people who did those machismo artwork that I didn't like. And most of my friends were sort of neo-conceptual artists who did more installations and objects. I wanted to insist on painting, but to do it in a way that I thought was very different. So intentionally using references to minor arts, like, you know, illuminated manuscripts, to forgotten epochs, like I would use early medieval art rather than, let's say, Renaissance, or 19th century illustration rather than, you know, something grand. But also paper, you know, like, yeah, the thing that in the market would cost less, but something that also is connected to books and that you can travel with very easily, and is small and is domestic, you know.
And the size also
quite small. I mean, the Blind Merchant is basically A4. The whole thing was done, I mean, we had computers already, but for instance, layout was not designed by computers yet. So I simply typed on an electric typewriter, printed, cut, went to a Xerox, you know, store, and did the book on A4 so I could easily copy it, you know. And then it, according to the plan, which never worked, it would be easily available to friends or whoever wanted it. And those are slightly bigger, but not much bigger. Yeah? Maybe 75 centimeters on 50, something like that. So I'm moving on to a very different piece, and which is Live and Die Zeva Braun, that gave the exhibition here its title. I said before that for many years I thought that the Holocaust cannot be tackled appropriately according to my criteria through art, and I spoke about it briefly a couple of days ago, so risking being tiresome to some of the people who heard me then, I would repeat some of the things I said. What I saw around me were maybe three different problems. One is what we call prosopopea, which is speaking for the dead. I mean, I think that a lot of what we can call work that deals with the Holocaust is premised on identification with the victim, especially in the culture that I come from, where it becomes almost necrophilic, right? We are the victims. That is obscene because I think that we do not have the right to speak for the dead, and I never wished to do that. It is also connected to the way in which I thought it was obscene to claim that you represent or you bear witness to what really happened, which again is something that I wanted to avoid. And those two things are connected in my mind to what can be termed instrumentalization of the Holocaust. That is, that if you speak for the dead and you represent the truth, then you deserve a lot of things. You have moral authority because you're the victim. You deserve compensation money because you were wronged to. You are always in the right. You don't have to question yourself morally. So you're also denying whatever occasion the Holocaust may be to think about moral problems of being a human being, you know, and of dealing with evil. And the other option, which is the more, let's say, dignified option, is the option of abstraction. A lot of theory having to do with art that deals with the Holocaust arrives at this point of muteness, right? The impossibility to articulate the tragedy of Auschwitz leads to a blank, you know, to a space or an abstract field onto which we project our inability to articulate. Yeah? But for me, it was also not a good solution because I thought that abstraction can be whatever you project onto it. It really does not have to do particularly with the Holocaust unless you will it to be so. And I wanted to deal with those issues explicitly. So Live and Die Zeva Braun was for me, at the time, a very, very difficult project. And it was a project that was defined almost, again, dialectically, in opposition to other things that I saw around me. And basically, the project exists in two forms, as an installation in the public sphere and as an artist's book. So it can be experienced as a kind of a part of an institution and a political social event, but also as a kind of a very intimate experience. And it is made of short text in 10 chapters and a plethora of works on paper, more than 60 works on paper, quite labor intensive. I'll show you some images in a second. The text basically offers, it's written like an advertising brochure, addressing you in the second person and providing an offer for the ultimate entertainment experience, which is via means of virtual reality, which in the mid-90s was a very state-of-the-art utopic technology, to become Hitler's lover, to experience intimacy with the Führer, to experience the suicide, that is death in life, and the short trip to hell, okay? And I'm showing you here just an image of the way that the work is usually installed, very unlike what we have here. The text is printed on black banners that can connote perhaps Nazi party gatherings, but also a kind of a modernist idiom, you know, the grid, minimalism. And the drawings are hung in clusters which are very different in nature, much more salon style or like a page of photographs in an old album. And the installation is improvised in the space. So it assumes a slightly different form in each city. Here I believe it's in Warsaw. So the text appears in two languages, the language of the origin and the language of the place. So it's English and Polish. And Hitler does not appear at all in the project, but the mustache as a kind of abstract sign hovers and glues itself uncomfortably to different images. In this case, it's a self-portrait again. It's based on a photograph of me when I was maybe 2 years old. And here you could see it's the same technique that we spoke about before, but here it gets this kind of almost photographic quality of... Yeah, there is a golden shower scenes in the text as a kind of a fantasy. And you see a kind of a cunnilingus / golden shower depiction here, which has a swastika moon, an eagle, a train, a teddy bear below. So a lot of images accumulate and hover and juxtapose one on top of the other. Again, in a kind of paradoxical existence, because the drip is another modernist idiom, usually connected or associated with spontaneity, chance, and so on and so forth. But here, of course, the drip are highly designed. This is another image, sort of condensing together, lumping together stories that do not really fit, which is Red Riding Hood, a story of a male transvestite, right, the wolf who likes to wear women's clothes, and also a kind of a male pregnancy because he swallows grandmother and Red Riding Hood, and then he gives birth, right? But also he dies at the process, and the wolf here is juxtaposed with the image of Judas Iscariot, who's often depicted with the sack of coins that he was given for his betrayal of Jesus, right? And the swastika assumes a kind of a mimetic function, double playing as a bed, a house, a tree. So you see that the images are not really illustrating the story, but rather they have a kind of a more complex relation to it. And if the text appears to be unequivocal, it offers you one thing. The drawings really bring together many, many different layers from, I would say, really a kind of an autobiographical layer of my own images to references to late German romantic landscapes, to the Brother Grimm fairy tales. Not so much in order to implicate German culture, but rather because this is part of my own upbringing, strangely enough, or maybe not so strangely. The Brother Grimm fairy tales, Erich Kästner, things like that were really part of the, I would say, literary diet of Israeli children. So I felt very much a sense of identification with those things. And really the process was about creating something that was intimate and beautiful and emotionally invested and seductive, but also in a way already tainted, yeah? Already kind of morally dubious. And to create, in other words, a position where ethics and aesthetics are inseparable and put you in an uncomfortable spot, okay? This is a landscape with two moons and a mustache. And this is, of course, Moritz from Max and Moritz. I don't know why, I always thought Moritz was the thin one. Combined with, of course, Caspar David Friedrich. And these look like prints, but in fact they're all hand-painted. It's like a kind of a strange monopoly. And you can see that some of the images, you can see, of course, something that appears in all my work, I think, a kind of a strong animist presence. I mean, almost everything is alive, uncomfortably so, the telephone, the fruits. A landscape becomes a face with the coffin as a mouth. Same with the chimney that sort of loses its erection with two moons as eyes. But also you can see, for instance, the M of McDonald's as a mouth of one of the grotesque characters. And that is perhaps the place to note that this is really not about Nazism and the Holocaust as an historical, authentic event, but rather about the present, right? It's a project that really tries to divine between what I called earlier prosopopeia, speaking for the dead, or dealing with the historical fact of Auschwitz, but rather with the different kinds of signs and the functions that it has in the present, from private nightmares to political rhetoric, to pedagogical rituals, etc., etc. So I'm really showing just a small selection. I'm showing those photographs, I'm sure all of you know, of that Hitler ordered in order to refine the art of rhetorics, which he mastered, to show another self-portrait, again, a kind of synthesis between my own face as a child and the gestures of Hitler. And that would also be the point, I think, where I will move to the next project by showing you a short snippet from a video, which combines the two, because the video deals with the next thing I'll speak about, Justine Frank, this artist that I've invented. But in this film, there is an interview with the woman who translated the writings to Hebrew. And she speaks about the connection between Roee Rosen and Justine Frank, and particularly about Liv and Zeva Brown. So it's a good opportunity to see also the reception of the work in Israel when it was first shown. So this is what we'll do now.
אחד האספקטים שקושרים באמת את עבודתו של רוזן לעבודה של פרנק הוא העיסוק בייצוג עצמי. רוזן צייר עצמו פעמים אחדות כדמויות נשיות בהקשר דתי, כגון הקדושות המעונות ברברה, אגנס ולוסי, ללא ספק בהשראת הנטייה של פרנק להציג עצמה בזהויות גבריות שונות, לפעמים, כמו בציור הגילדה של פרנק, במעין דיוקן עצמי קבוצתי, אבל ההשפעה הזו נהייתה גורפת ממש בתערוכתו של רוזן, חיי ומות כאווה בראון, שהוצגה במוזיאון ישראל. המיצב כלל ציורים וטקסט שפנה אל לקוח או לקוחה בגוף שני, והזמין אותו או אותה להפוך ולהיות אווה בראון, כביכול באמצעות הדמיה מלאכותית. המבקרים במוזיאון הוזמנו לחוות לא רק רגעים של אינטימיות עם הפירר בשלהי המלחמה, אלא גם התאבדות, כלומר מוות בחיים, ואף ביקור קצר בגיהנום. כפי שניתן היה לצפות, התערוכה עוררה תגובות קשות, ואף חוללה שערורייה פוליטית קטנה.
תערוכה שפוגעת במשפחות שעברו את השואה, האם היא מסתכלת בהומור או באיזה היבט סלחני על היטלר?
Skandal, Skandal, sofort schließen, riefen Politiker, ohne die Ausstellung zu sehen. Einladung zu einem obszönen Albtraum. Fantasien über Sex und Tod mit Adolf Hitler. Bizarr, pornografisch, ironisch. Eine Provokation. Roee Rosen, der Künstler, ich weiß, dass ich provoziere, aber ich will nur Fragen stellen. Was kann man tun gegen das Vergessen?
מטריד אותי שעושים פורנוגרפיה מהשואה, שבאצטלה של אומנות עושים דברים מתועבים, ואני אומר לך את זה בשיקול דעת ולאט, דבר מתועב. לא ראיתי את התערוכה, אני דיברתי נגד האידיאולוגיה של התערוכה, ולשם כך אני לא צריך לראות אותה, ואני אומר לך, ואני בא לעניין הזה מצד השואה. זאת אומרת, לא יכול להיות שאנחנו נזדהה רק עם עצמנו כ6 מיליון קורבנות. אנחנו צריכים להבין את משחקי הפרוורטים של אווה בראון והיטלר במוזיאון ישראלי. מתועב, צריך לזרוק את זה מהמוזיאון, ואחר כך צריך לחטא את המוזיאון לפני שעושים בתערוכה.